Hello everyone and welcome to another random bits and pieces segment from my brain, and today sit a while for we are having another Aki slash FHM7 tutorial. So today's tutorial might be a little bit shorter than the first two. That may be a good thing. Because the first two ones were pretty long. What happened is that after I completed the second tutorial, I realized that I forgot to talk about a pretty important segment that has to do with rosters and everything. So I'm going to be calling this tutorial basically 2.5, and we're gonna kind of add to that, but we're also going to be adding value to all of that, because something happened that made me realize that maybe I should explain a few things a little bit further. So hopefully I can clear things up. As usual, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. If you have any requests, let me know in the comments as well. I will try to do my best here. So the thing that I forgot to talk about last time, and I had it written down, right here, I have a little notebook, and I had put notes, but somehow I skipped over it. So, and it's the difference between the different type of free agents. So there are two different type of free agents in the NHL. There are unrestricted free agents, and there are restricted free agents. Now, in real life, in the NHL of outside of the video game, it gets slightly more complicated than that. But for the most part, that's pretty accurate, and that's pretty much all you have to worry about with the game. Is that there are free agents that are unrestricted and free agents that are restricted. Now, all of that has to do with time spent in the NHL plus, their age and everything. So that's the indicator. The indicator as to when a player turns into an unrestricted. So basically, the younger the player is, okay, the more likely they are to be what is called restricted free agent. So what that means is that the team holding the rights as kind of holds that particular player's future, if you would, kind of in their hands. So a restricted free agent has very little say in their career path as far as staying on the team and everything, and even to a certain point contract negotiations, mostly because the team that owns the player owns the rights to the player as well. So basically what that means is that a restricted free agent contract expires. So contracts in the NHL always expire on June 30th, so that they turn a free agent on July 1st. So in the case of a restricted free agent, it says in the name restricted, right? So one thing needs to happen is that the team holding the rights need to make what is called a qualifying offer. So that number, the money for that qualifying offer, comes from the previous salary, and I think the experience of the player and everything kind of boils into that, but it's basically kind of the minimum that you can pay to retain a player. So basically just see it as retaining a player's rights. You're almost never going to see a young player sign for the qualifying offer. After that, they always negotiate a longer term and more money, but it's basically the money that the team puts down to keep the rights on the player. Now, if the team doesn't put down money to retain the rights with a qualifying offer, at that point the player becomes an unrestricted free agent. We had a prime example of that in the last season with my team, the Ottawa Senators. So the Sens, prior to last season, acquired Anthony Duclair, and at the end of the last season, he was still a restricted free agent, but the Sens decided to not qualify him. So on July 1st, Well, it wasn't July 1st, technically because of COVID and everything. But if you keep that into a normal time frame, on July 1st, Anthony Duclair became an unrestricted free agent, and he was able to negotiate a contract with absolutely anybody in the league, and he ended up signing in Florida. So that is what happens when you don't qualify a player. After a team, and that should be in the game as well, after a team qualifies a player, you have until December 1st. Again, in a normal year, not with the COVID rules and calendar and everything, but in a normal year, you have until December 1st to come to an agreement with a contract with that particular restricted free agent that you made a qualify offer with. If you don't sign him by December 1st, then you cannot get that player to play for your team for the remainder of the season. So we saw that a couple years ago with Toronto in real life. Toronto had William Nylander that was qualified, but Toronto was so cut at the cap and everything, they couldn't find an agreement with Nylander. So Nylander stayed home, and the time passed and everything, and then Toronto, like right before December 1st, managed to sign him and everything, and then Nylander was allowed to come to play for the team. Had the team not been able to come to an agreement with Nylander prior to December 1st, Nylander would not have been able to play for the Leafs that season. So that's why it was a huge deal, and they were all of the broadcasts were talking about that. At least if the broadcast had just even a little to do with Toronto, they were talking about that. So that's what happens with a restricted free agent. So now we saw what happens if you qualify him, but we saw the last date that you have to sign him. We saw what happens if you don't qualify him. And then there's another thing that might happen, and it is called an offer sheet. So keep in mind, when you do a qualifying offer, you're only retaining the rights to the player, right? So you're not technically signing him. So that means that there's a period of time there where other teams can go ahead and try to sign your player, even though the rights are yours. Thankfully, there's a way to kind of protect that from just having the richer teams just poach players. Basically, there's kind of a compensation through the offer sheet, and it's all based on how much money you are offering. So offer sheets are pretty rare, but there was one instance of it couple years ago, with Montreal making an offer sheet to Carolina's Sebastian Howe. So Montreal offered a certain amount of money per year, and then once a team makes an offer like that to one of your restricted free agents that you have not signed, you have the option to either equal the offer that was made, and then for the same amount of years and same money, you can either match that and then keep your player, or you can let the player go and sign with the other team, and then you get your compensation. So the compensation depends on how much money is given. The numbers I'm going to show you might not be 100% accurate because they're a few years old, but it's going to give you an idea of the ballpark here. So I'm going to go ahead and pause my recording here for just a second. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the window that I have for that, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at that together. Alright, so here we are. Thankfully my face here is not covering the important part. Also, I just noticed that there's a cat here behind me, so if you hear a whine, don't just disregard her. She loves to get attention, especially from me. So anyway, so here we have kind of the graphic, if you would, of the compensation. So what you need to look at is, like I said, the numbers are a few years old, so I don't think that they changed much, especially since there's been a salary cap freeze and everything, but that gives you a pretty good idea. So, for example, if there's a restricted free agent on another team that you want to get and that you're offering, 1,339,575 or below, then there's no compensation if the other team let him go. It's pretty rare that usually when you see a team make an offer sheet, it's gonna be around those numbers here. That's usually because it's a pretty good player. You want to get him and everything, so you're offering, of course, good money to kind of insist that player to come and sign with you. And that's another thing that I kind of didn't explain properly, but that with that process is that the other team is actually making an offer to your player. Now your player has an offer to decline the offer outright. So in the case of Sebastian Howe that I was talking about, where Montreal approached him, Howe decided that yes, he would sign that contract with Montreal. That's why Carolina had to either match the offer, which is what they did, or to let him go and then get the draft pick compensation package. So yeah, your player has to agree to sign that contract, and then you're left in the position of either matching or letting him go. Now, if the offer is between those numbers here, then you get a third round pick. Now, one thing that's very important to note, especially if you're going to be playing Franchise Hockey Manager 7, is that those pick compensation has to be yours. So, for example, if you're trying to sign an RFA for, let's say, 5.5 million, that would fall into that threshold that you have here, then you need to have your own first and third round draft pick. If you've traded your first round draft pick in a different trade to somebody else and you don't have your first round draft pick, you cannot make that offer. Even if you made a trade with, let's say you make a trade with San Jose and you get San Jose's first round draft pick, you cannot do this offer sheet here because that first round draft pick needs to be yours. And then, you see all of the different, I'm not going to all of those, but yeah, when you're at the point where you're offering over, $10 million a year for a player, first of all, that player ought to be really good, but look at what it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you your first round draft picks for the next 4 years. So, so it's kind of a balancing act, right? Is it worth losing your first round draft picks for the next 4 years? Is that worth losing for that one player? In some cases it might. I mean, maybe that's the exact player that's just missing on your team to make your team over the top, and then your first round draft picks are going to be lower and everything, and maybe not worth as much. So it's something you might think about, but that's definitely something you need to think about because 4 first round picks is a lot. All right, so we're going to come back here. Alright, so back within the game. So I explained pretty much what a restricted free agent is, right? So that's a player that you still own the rights to. That's a player that you should be making a qualifying offer if you want to retain their rights. If you don't, on July 1st, they're going to become an unrestricted free agent, which I'm going to explain here in a second what it is. Then if you qualify them, other teams have the option to try to make an offer sheet. And then if your player decides that they are willing to sign that contract, then you have the option to either match the offer or let the player go. And then if you qualify the player, you have until December 1st of that year to come to an agreement with a contract with that player, or that player will not be able to play for your team. And I gave you the example of William Nylander a few years back with Toronto. So that's pretty much it with restricted free agents. Now we're going to talk about unrestricted free agents. So the name kind of implies that there's no restriction, right? So an unrestricted free agent is usually going to be older than a restricted free agent. So after a certain amount of years in the league, a player will become an unrestricted free agent. That means that whenever they become a free agent on July 1st, they are free to sign with anybody they want. Now, keep in mind, a team keeps the rights to a player until they become a free agent. So until July 1st, where the contract is completely expired, you always have a choice to negotiate a contract with a player whose contract is about to expire. So, for example, if there's a player that you really like on your team, but it's his last year of contract and you don't want to let him go, then during their last contract year, and it needs to be the last contract year. You cannot do that if the guy still has 3 years on their contract. On the last contract year, you can go ahead and make a contract offer to extend the player. So that's called extending a player. So he's still contracted with you, and then you offer him another contract, let's say for 4 more years. You want the guy for 4 more years on your team. He's really good. Your team is winning with him and everything. You want to bring him back. Offer a contract extension of 4 years. If you don't, then he becomes a free agent on July 1st. You still can, on July 1st, you still can go ahead and negotiate a contract with that player, but so can all of the other teams in your league. So you have to kind of take that into consideration. And, you know, if another team goes ahead and signs the player, you get nothing for him because he is an unrestricted free agent. So, again, there's kind of a layer of having to plan and think about, okay, do I want that player? He's getting older. Do I want him for 4 more years? You know, what if he declines in ability? Is he still going to be useful? Is he going to be passed by other players? And then, of course, if you play, modern day with the salary cap, then is his salary going to amputate me for 4 years where I'm not going to be able to do anything? So you have to think about those kind of things, whether you're dealing with an unrestricted free agent or a restricted free agent. So keep in mind that, in a modern day setting, you always have the salary cap that's kind of over your head, just watching at you and be like, oh, well, you don't have that much money left, you can't really afford this guy. So we kind of always have to keep that in mind. So that's pretty much it for free agency. I kind of let that slide a little bit in the last video, and I apologize for that. It should have been in the last video, and after I recorded it, I felt a little bad about it, but then I figured I would just kind of make a kind of an addition to the previous video and add free agency to that. So now you have it. It's all explained: restricted free agent, unrestricted free agent, and what it all implies. Alright, so now I think we're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna take some water. There you go. And now I think we're gonna talk about the different ways to acquire players, because I'm throwing terms around, and I've been following hockey since I was about that big, but it might not be the case for you, especially if you're watching tutorial videos. You probably want to learn a little bit more. So ways to acquire players. So all of the ways to acquire players in real life are, of course, in Franchise Hockey Manager 7. Right, so as you know, when you come to this window here, you have all of your players. Right now I have a lot of players because it's still preseason. Okay, and the first way to acquire a player is probably the simplest of them all. It is to draft the player. Now, if you draft the player, obviously you're going to have control over that player's rights for a certain amount of time. We kind of saw that a little bit with restricted free agents, right? So, whenever you sign a prospect to their first contract, it's always going to be an entry-level contract, and the terms are determined by the league depending on where the player is coming from and their age and everything. So usually it's 3 years, and then the salary cap it depends on a few factors. Sometimes you're going to see an entry-level contract of 2 years. That's usually the American college players because they're older. And it's also that, they can get to the trajectory to it. Unrestricted free agent status at around the same age, basically. So on the team here, we have plenty of players again. And they've not all been acquired the same way. So if we look at Thomas Chabot, so we can see it. Okay, so he was acquired, in 2015 at the draft. He was the 18th pick that year. And he was selected by the Ottawa Senators. So that's a player that the Sens have drafted and developed themselves, and he's pretty good. So, that's the easiest way to get him. Now, if you look at Christian Wolanin, we should be able to see the same thing. Alright, he was selected in the 4th round in 2015, same year as Chabot, by the Ottawa Senators. If you go and take a look at Chris Tierney. Alright, so Chris Tierney was picked in the 2nd round in 2012 by the San Jose Sharks. So that means we acquired that player in a different way. Did I say there were... I think I said there were 3 different ways to acquire a player. Really, there's 4. I don't know what I was thinking. Probably not thinking much, to be honest. Okay, so... drafting the player is pretty much the easiest way to acquire a player, so it's pretty simple, really. I mean, you have drafts in every sport, right? So in baseball, I think there's 50 rounds of drafts. That's crazy. In hockey right now, in modern day, there are 7 rounds. Earlier in hockey history, there used to be 9 rounds, and then at one point there were 11 rounds, but right now it's 7 rounds. So you're only drafting 7 players, so you kind of need to be able to... Well, in a normal year, you're only picking 7 players. If you've traded for draft picks and everything, of course, you're going to be drafting more or less depending on how many picks you have. But generally speaking, you should have 7 draft picks. So you kind of have to make sure that your picks are going to be pretty solid. There's no surefire way to do that, but typically, the higher your pick is, then the highest the potential of the player should be. And there's always some surprises, every year, at least in real life. You're going to see a guy come out in the 6th round, like Pavel Datsyuk was a 6th round draft pick, and he was a pretty good player. Henrik Zetterberg was a 7th round draft pick, and he became a pretty good player. So, of course, you're always going to have some surprises late in the draft, and you can get those in the game from time to time as well. Just like, the highest potential players should be at the top, so you want like a 1st round draft pick, right? And you want it to be as high as possible so that you have the best choice for a good potential player. But just like there are some surprises with later picks, that become really good players, sometimes you have players that have pretty good potential that just never pan out. And of course, as a Sens fan, I can always refer to Alexander Daigle for that. In 1993, we drafted Alexander Daigle, who was the superhero in juniors and everything, and he went 1st overall, and he never... he had a couple decent seasons, but he never became the superstar he was supposed to be. So that's always possible. So that's the first way to acquire a player. Second way is, of course, through a trade. So through a trade... Okay, so it's, for some reason, it's not listed in here. Alright, so, of course, in a trade, you're going to be trading, players and or picks for players and or picks, and then they go each way. Sometimes there's a third team that's going to get in there, and then players from here are going to go to the team up there that are going to send players there, so that because sometimes you just don't have a match for a trade between just two teams. That's in real life. There's no trading with three teams in the game, at least not yet, in Franchise Hockey Manager 7. So you can only do like a trade with another team, and trading picks and players. So I was looking at Chris Tierney because that's a player that the Sens acquired through trade in the Erik Karlsson trade, but I don't think that we have yeah, it's not in there. So I thought maybe it would be, but it is not. What about Nick Paul? No. Alright, so Alright, so okay, if you follow any other sport, most sports have trading of some sort, and the rules are sometimes a little bit different. For example, in baseball, now I know a lot of you might be coming from baseball. In baseball, you cannot trade draft picks. The MLB doesn't allow trading a draft pick as part of a trade package. However, in the MLB, you can send cash in a trade, which you cannot do in hockey. So you cannot. You used to be able to in hockey, but they got rid of that a while ago. So in hockey, you have to either trade a player that you have under contract, a player whose rights you own because you drafted him, but you still haven't gotten him a contract, or draft picks. So those are kind of the three assets that you have when you want to make a trade. So if there's a player that's on the other team that you want to try to get, then you have to get into the interface. Okay, and I'm gonna show you. Alright, so let's say that I want to go and get Seth Jones. Alright, so I want Seth Jones. So you're going to come in here and you're going to right click on the player you want to get. And then you're going to go to trade offer here. Alright, so now it shows that the Blue Jackets are going to be offering me Seth Jones. Now I'm like, okay, what do I want to offer them? Now my scout here is saying that they have a weakness at goalie and at center. Then you're like, okay, well, I'm going to offer them Joey Daccord. And then you kind of have some feedback that shows up here that kind of tells you if you're offering enough or not. That's, within the game. Then you're like, oh, maybe I need to add, a draft pick. So let's send them back their second round draft pick in the trade. And then, and then you kind of, temper with that. And then you come in here and then you offer the trade. Then they're going to either accept right away or get back to you later with the final say on what they want to do. So that's one way to go for a trade. That's if there's a player that you absolutely want. So that's me saying, okay, I absolutely want Seth Jones. I'm going to try to acquire Seth Jones in a trade. And I go in there and select it. Now you can also go in here and go to transactions. And then in here, you can go to the trading block, and from here you can see what players teams are trying to actively trade. So now I'm looking at that and I'm like, okay. And then maybe I'm like, okay, I want Jay Beagle. So then you can come from here. Now, typically, if a team is trying to actively trade a player, they will sometimes accept a little less for that player. So that's another way that you can try to make a trade with a team. That's you going with, okay, the team doesn't necessarily want this player anymore, so let's see what yes, I could use Jay Beagle. Let's see what they want for him and everything, and then you can go from there. So that's, of course, another way to trade here. Right, so that's two ways to make trades. Sorry, to acquire players. So, well, it was two ways to make trades true. So that was still true, but that's two ways to acquire players. So probably the best way, draft the player and then trade for the player. If you're not able to get him. Or to draft him, or to get him any other way. Another way to get a player is to sign him as a free agent. So we talked about free agents earlier. So again, you would come here, you would go to transactions, right, and then by default that's going to be the first thing that's selected there on free agents. Now personally, okay, and you can do what you want, personally whenever I look for free agents, I go to the filter here. Okay, and I make sure that I click the signable button here, because the game has a tendency to put rookies from other teams that you can't really sign or anything like that. So I make sure that I click the signable button, and then I will often go ahead and uncheck restricted free agents, because I'm not necessarily always willing to part with my draft picks. Sometimes I'm going to go ahead and take a look at what's there and then try to ponder if it's worth it. But usually I'm going to look at unrestricted free agents, and then usually when I go to look for free agents, I have an idea of what I need. So for the Sens right now, in real life, they probably could use some defense. So we're going to go ahead and look at defensemen that I can sign, but only the unrestricted free agent. You can mess with all of that here. I probably wouldn't, but definitely you can. I mean, if you want absolutely a defenseman that's available with 15 passing, you can go ahead and set that. Personally, I don't do it, but you can if you want. Then you click on OK, and it's going to show me all of the defensemen that I can sign that are available on free agent. And if we're looking solely at the ability stars, it would appear that the best is Sami Vatanen. So I could then come here and right click on Sami Vatanen, and then I could offer a contract, or you can offer a training camp tryout as well, which is new in this iteration of the game. So with a tryout, you get to try a player playing with your team, and then you get to see if you want to go ahead and sign him after that. So that's how you would get into the free agency and sign players. Now, usually you should try to look at free agents on July 1st. That's where the pool of free agents is going to be the biggest, because you have all of those contracts that expire. So you want to go ahead and usually look on July 1st. But there's things that might be happening during the course of the season that makes you look at, free agency. Maybe you lose, a few centers on your team due to injury, and they're going to be long injuries, and you don't really have any young players that are ready to jump in, and you have a little bit of money, and you're like, well, I don't really want to trade because those guys are going to come back. So sometimes signing a free agent in that situation might be a good idea, to look for, a replacement player. He's probably not going to be as good as your players that you have on the team, but he might be able to help a little bit more than an alpha star player that's still developing in your minors. So that's where you would probably look, during the course of the season. But typically you should really look at that, early in July, when there's the most interesting and the most amount of the biggest amount of defensemen available. Okay, so that's for free agents, and of course, you can put the restricted free agents in there. I don't know if there's any right now. Yeah, there's some. So now we have like Vince Dunn that got added, and then Cernak and Ethan Bear got added. So for those, if I want to sign those guys, sorry, I said the word in French. If you want to sign those guys, then you would have to, pay the compensation that we looked at earlier, depending on how much money you offer to the player. So that's why I usually go and, just take that out. Also, because of depending on where you're at in the year, keep in mind a restricted free agent that doesn't have a contract and it's close to December 1st, it's gonna be very risky to sign that guy. Well, no, signing him won't, but trying to acquiring him through trade would be. Sorry, I got my wires confused in my head or something. It tends to happen sometimes, especially when I'm speaking nonstop for as long as I have been. So yeah, if you sign the player outright, that's fine. But if you trade for a player that's a restricted free agent real close to December 1st, then you might not have the time to negotiate a contract with him, and then you basically traded for a player you can't use that season. So you should go ahead and make sure you watch that. All right, and then so we've looked at drafting players. Typically, your team should be comprised mostly of players that you have drafted. Keep in mind, it's not an exact science, but more and more, and especially in, I would say, in the past 10 years or so, the focus really has shifted into developing your own homegrown talent that you have drafted. And then trying to get players to complement those players, to kind of fill a void in your lineup. Wasn't always like that though. Like I know the Rangers for one team like in the 90s were very good about spending a whole lot of dollars for players, going after the most expensive free agents and everything, and it didn't serve them very well. They did that for a while, like at the end of the 90s and then all the way into the 2000s and everything, until the salary cap didn't quite work for them. So they had very few like players that they had developed themselves, and just like I paid free agents and everything, and it just didn't turn out. You don't see that as much anymore, and mostly what you're gonna see is a lot of homegrown talent and some other players added to that. So drafting is first. Second is making a trade. You're trying to get a player. That way, third is signing a free agent. Sometimes that's the route you have to take. Sometimes you need a guy that can put the puck in the net, and you don't have a lot of good shooters on your team. You go on the free agent market and you see if you can overpay a little bit for a player that can, score goals. And then the fourth way is typically you're not going to get superstars that way, but the fourth way would be to pick up a player on waivers. So I explained what waivers was a little bit in the previous video that I made, but basically when a player is either on a one-way contract or sometimes on a two-way contract with a certain amount of pro playing time, a team to send a player down into the minors, the player is going to need to clear waivers. So what that means is that the player is put on a list where any other team can claim him, and they have 24 hours to do so, or at least they have until I believe it's noon Eastern time the next day to do that. Okay, so when you're looking at your own team, you're going to see here waivers. Right now, it all says no. So right now, I can send anybody that I want down, regardless of contract, because it's preseason. So it's a kind of a special time to be in. However, during the season, some of those are going to flip to yes. Like, for example, Anders Nilsson would flip to yes. So if I were to want to send Anders Nilsson down during the season, you would have to clear waivers, and then the other teams can claim him. So I don't remember in my previous video if I said that or no. So there used to be a bug, I guess, that was there since Franchise Hockey Manager 6, where the computer would never, ever, ever, under any circumstance, claim any of your players that you put on waivers. Well, they fixed that last week, I believe. in franchise like Manager 7, and you can now actually lose players on waivers if you put them through waivers. So you can't really use that as a trick anymore to kind of get rid of players you don't want on your roster, knowing that the computer won't claim them. The computer might, so just keep that in mind. Now, if a player doesn't have to clear waivers, he's going to go straight to the minors without having to go through waivers, obviously. But that's the window you want to look at, and you want to look under waivers here. Again, during regular season, some of those are going to flip to yes, and those that say yes here are going to need to clear waivers. So you need to keep that in mind if you're trying to send them down. In the default view, for the home view here, when you click on the little house icon, you're brought here. In the default view, you're gonna have the waivers here. So you might sim a few days, and then you come here and you see oh, Anders Nilsson, and then it's going to tell you the cap hit and everything, and then you can right click on the player and claim him. That's another way to claim players or to acquire players, is to get them on the waivers. Usually players that go through waivers are not, the best players. I mean, think about it, from your own team's perspective. You're not going to try to send down your number one center through waivers. It just doesn't make any sense, right? So the other teams don't do that either. So usually you're going to see players that are usually maybe 1 star, 1 star and a half, maybe sometimes 2 stars get through waivers, and then it's up to you to decide if you want to pick them up or not. Keep in mind, if you acquire a player through waivers, you need to make room for them on your lineup, so you need to send somebody down. So make sure you're not having to send down one of your players that's better than the player you're claiming. In real life, there's waiver claims all the time, but they're usually for lesser players. Probably the most notable waiver claim that has happened in recent history would be Montreal picking up Paul Byron off waivers from Calgary. Paul Byron turned out to be able to score 20 goals a season for Montreal for a few years, so that's probably one of the really best waiver pickup that you're gonna see, but that's pretty rare. Usually players that are picked up on waivers end up in the minors or playing a very secondary role on your team. But from time to time, again, if you have a hole on your team, you have a few defensemen that are banged up and something, sometimes that's a cheap way to acquire a player to play for your team, for a couple weeks until your better players come back, and then you can put that player back through waivers, and and so on and so forth, as long as you have the money for him under the cap. If you're playing modern era, just always keep that in mind. So that's pretty much the 4 ways that you can acquire a player: draft them, trade for them, sign them as a free agent, or pick them up from waivers. That's pretty much how you are going to build your team. I am in the school of thought that you should be, drafting your own team and building around what you draft, and then, acquire other players to complement that. I am really of that school of thought. If you're like, I'm just drafting players so that I can trade them for better players, I mean, you can do that for sure. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that if you win and everything, and you're having fun. Keep in mind, it's a video game, so as long as you're having fun, you're doing it right, as far as I'm concerned. I'm just saying you what my preference is, and it is usually to try to build my own team from my own drafts and everything, and then try to figure it out from there. But there's definitely a couple ways you can go about building your team. And then, oh my god, I said my video would be probably a little bit shorter, and I guess I lied. We're gonna go ahead and talk about one more thing that I wanted to talk about. So, through my videos on YouTube and everything, I made a friend that is from Germany. So, hello, Robin! Okay, anyway. So, and he's a nice guy and everything, and he likes hockey, but he doesn't know too much about the rules and everything. So he's been asking me a lot of questions, and of course I don't mind answering questions, but it kind of popped in my head that if he has an interest in hockey and that he sort of kind of understands the rules, but that he has those kind of questions, and maybe other people do too. So I kind of wanted to bring that up, and hopefully it's going to be helpful for some people as well. And it is, why should I make a trade? And when is it smart to trade? And when should you not trade? So I'm going to try to address that the best way that I can. Unfortunately, that's a little bit of a subjective subject. There's no necessarily right or wrong way to approach trading, so I want to bring that up front. So what I'm going to bring up is mostly my own philosophy about it. Of course, yours can differ, and that's okay. And if it works for you, that's fine. So for me, there's basically so for me, a trade is something that stems from a need that you have, and the need for me is going to be one of two things. The need that you have is either going to be a hockey need. I need a better defenseman, and I have an extra center that I can trade to get that defenseman. Or it's going to be a logistics deal, like, hey, I have this guy, his contract is expiring, we're not going to be making the playoffs, but this guy has some value, and I'm not bringing him back up next year, so I'm going to trade him for whatever assets I can get. So that, for me, that's more of a logistics trade as opposed to a hockey trade. So when should you trade? Well, there's a trade deadline first and foremost in the NHL, just like in any other pro sports. And I believe that I talked about that in the previous video that I made. Technically, in the NHL, you can trade after the trade deadline, but the players that you acquire that way cannot play for you in the playoffs if you make the playoffs. And I believe that I gave the example of Boston acquiring Marty Turco about 20 years ago or something, maybe a little less. They made the trade for Marty Turco after the trade deadline because they had some problems with their goaltending, but Turco was not able to participate in the playoffs, so he was just there to help the team keep afloat until then. But technically, you should be making trades prior to the trade deadline, of course. The best time to trade is when you feel it's the right time. I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer than that. Typically, you probably want to address needs in the off season. So in the off season, you already have kind of an idea of what your team is gonna look like, and I'm talking after you have signed free agents and everything. Maybe you're like, yeah, okay, I went after this defenseman and he's pretty good, but he decided to sign somewhere else, so now I don't really have anybody there. So that's one way to try to address that weakness, is to trade, and you do it in the off season. So if you watch some of my live streams that I do with my friend JT Dutch, for him that's almost always where he's going to make 100% of his trades. Is during the off season, unless he gets a huge rash of injuries during the season. But most of his trades are going to be done in the off season before the season starts, and that's definitely a time to do that because you already kind of envision what your team is going to look like already. Typically, I know for me, I don't really make trades in the first couple months of the season. I want to get a good feel of what my team is doing, and 1 month of hockey is like 13 games because October is always a light schedule. So in 13 games, I think that it's too small of a sample size for me to be able to gauge, I absolutely need a new defenseman right now because we're allowing a few more goals than the opposition in those 13 games, and it's unacceptable. thing is that your team might turn it around the next month or something like that. So those are what I would call panic moves, and I try to avoid them as much as possible. Now, if you have something that falls in your lap and it's absolutely a great trade, by all means you should go ahead and do it. But I personally do not seek trades really early in the season, because I kind of want to make sure that I have a sense of what my team is going to look like. Usually by the end of December, start of January is where I'm going to start considering maybe trading for something that I absolutely need. So, like, oh, yeah, my right wingers are really not doing all that good. Maybe I need to add some scoring there or something like that. Then I'm going to start looking at that at that point. So I'm going to be looking at, what's available on the block. I'm going to look at the scoring leaders. And of course, I'm not going to try to go for the top scorer, because more than likely, he's going to be too expensive to get. But, sometimes you can get a guy that can score 20, 25 goals, and you don't have to sell the farm for that player. So that's definitely something that I can consider. Excuse me. So and then the more the season progresses, then you have a better and better idea of what your team has to give. And then of course around the trading deadline, historically in the NHL is where a lot of the deals happen. Although lately, in the past 5 years or so, teams seem to like to trade prior to the trade deadline, and then the trade deadline is not as busy as it used to be. I remember in the 2000s, the trade deadline was just crazy, and it was like a TV show that lasted, I don't know how many hours, and people would get up really early so that they could catch all of the action and everything. Now it's not as prevalent in that regard. Teams kind of make their moves a little bit earlier. After all, if you have a need that you identify in January, why wait until the end of February to make the trade if the opportunity is there? So that's for the timing of the trade, right? So off season might be a good time to trade, because you can already picture what your team is going to look like. Then start of the season, I would usually advise caution into making big trades there. Give your team the time to turn things around. Keep in mind, small sample size, right? Then I would say around January might be a good time to start looking. By then you've played almost half of the season, and if you're really struggling in a position, that might be the time to pull the trigger on a trade. Then of course the trade deadline is where you can make your final preparations regarding a trade. So that would be the timing for trading. Now, why trading? Well, that's because you have a need. Okay, I made the example, I need a defenseman, and I have a few good centers, and I can live without Joe as my center, so I'm gonna try to get Paul, the defenseman, and I'm gonna see if they're interested to get Joe for Paul. Okay, well, they want more for Paul than just Joe, so I'm gonna add a second round draft pick to the trade. Okay, do I need my second round draft pick? Am I going to the playoffs? That's all things you have to take into consideration. Technically, if you're not going to be making the playoffs, you shouldn't be trading a 23-year-old Paul for 31-year-old Joe over here. Just for the sake of making a trade. It doesn't make much sense. Whenever you're missing the playoffs, you should try to be you should go into what's called a seller mode, where you should be trying to trade players that you don't see having a future with your team long term, and you should trade them for either younger assets or draft picks. So if you're rebuilding, okay, it doesn't make much sense to trade a 23-year-old player because he has good value to get a 32-year-old defenseman, because he has good value right now, but he's 32. Is he really going to help you develop long term? Probably not. So that's probably not a smart trade to make. Now, if roles are reversed, now if you're going to be missing the playoffs and you have that very good 32-year-old defenseman, 4-star player, on an expiring contract that you're not going to be bringing back because he wants too much money, you can trade him to a team that's that's expecting to make the playoffs for probably a couple good prospects and or draft picks and everything, and then you take that all and then you kind of keep the wheel moving. With the picks, you try to get better players, and then the younger players that you got in the trade, you try to develop so that they can become better, get on your team, make your team better in the future. That's probably how you should look at it. So that would be a logistic trade. I have this older guy, he's on an expiring contract, I'm not making the playoffs. Those guys here are interested into my guy, so they are offering me XYZ, and I want XYZ, so I am shipping them the 32-year-old that's not coming back anyway, and I'm getting those nice picks and prospects, and hopefully in the end I'm going to turn out on top. Sometimes they're going to trade for prospects and they're not going to develop very well. That's a shame when that happens, but it does happen. So that's a logistic trade. Now, sometimes you're going to make what is called a hockey trade. You're going to go ahead and trade a player that's pretty good, and you're going to trade him for another player that's pretty good, but playing a different position that you need on your team. So you have a center, and they have a defenseman. They have extra defensemen. They can live without this guy. You can live without this guy. And then you just swap them, and then you've improved your D, and then you move on. That's a hockey trade. You don't see those as often anymore, to be honest. But there's some examples of trades like that happen. On top of my head, I can remember the trade between Nashville and Columbus that sent Ryan Johansson to Nashville for Seth Jones. So Ryan Johansson was a young, upcoming center, and Nashville wasn't very deep at center at the time, and they had extra defensemen, so Seth Jones is a defenseman, and they sent Seth Jones to Columbus for Ryan Johansson. So it was a hockey trade. There wasn't any drama in that trade or anything like that. It was just, hey, we need more defense, you need more centers, let's go ahead and trade. Both players were pretty young and everything, so that's a trade that made a lot of sense at that point. So this is a hockey trade. And when is the best time to do a hockey trade? Well, again, it depends on your guts. First of all, if the trade falls on your lap and they are offering you something you cannot refuse, then by all means make the trade. But typically you should wait a little bit, make sure that that the results you are getting are not just a small sample size. So something else that was asked to me about something else that someone asked me is when you make a trade, do contract matters and the money, does it matter? So I mean, to an extent, and the example that was given to me, would a $6 million player be traded for a $3 million player? And I mean, you can. First of all, you need to make sure you have the room under the cap. That's a $3 million difference right there. So depending on which way the salary goes, you need to make sure that the team that's getting $3 more millions on their salary cap can afford to have that money on the cap. And then after that, it's all about the difference in age, ability, position, and everything. I mean, if you need this $6 million guy, but he's 31, but he's still a 3-star defenseman, and you need defense, and you're shipping out a younger centerman that's only $3 million but has a higher potential, that's up to you if you want to make that trade or not. It sucks to part ways with a player that has good potential, but sometimes you need to if you absolutely need better players. However, that's something that I would consider mostly in hockey trades. In a logistic trade, it doesn't really make much sense to kind of swap big salaries like that. Usually you're going to be swapping a player for like prospects and picks. And that brings me to my last point that I want to bring up, and I said that this video would be probably shorter, and here we are an hour later again with me talking again. Typically what you would like to do is identify early players that are on your team on expiring contracts that you are not going to bring back. If you have followed my my Franchise Hockey Manager 6 series or my current Franchise Hockey Manager 7 series, if you follow them a little bit, you're going to notice that every February 1st, I go and I go through all of my players that are on expiring contracts. So to find them out, you come in here, and then you go to transactions here, and then you're gonna have upcoming free agents here. So you're gonna see all of your players that have 1 year remaining on their contract. That means that you have them only for the current season left, and then you're going to go ahead and decide on who you want to keep. So in that situation here, I would be like, oh yeah, I absolutely want to keep Brady Tkachuk. So I would go ahead and renew his contract. So you're going to see me do that every February. I'm going to go through all of those, and then I'm going to bring back some, and then a lot of them I'm going to let go. And then you're going to see the offers that you've made here in this particular window and the money that you're going to be offering them. After that, okay, I'm going to be like, okay, Michael Haley, I'm not bringing back. So you should be trying to trade those players for as much assets as you can. Now, if you're going on a playoff run and everything, don't trade all of your players that are on expiring contracts. You might need them to perform in the playoffs and everything. But if you're not going to be making the playoffs, or even if you're going to make the playoffs, there might be a couple players you can live without. So it's usually a good idea to come here in the transactions, come here, look at who has expiring contracts and who you want to keep, who you don't mind losing, and those that you don't mind losing, try to trade them for assets as much as possible. Maybe you're only going to get a draft pick, but you know what? Getting a draft pick is better than losing the player for absolutely nothing on July 1st. So that's something to consider. You can make some trades sometimes where you get decent players. In my current Tampa Bay historical, I got a team that offered me a 19-year-old Ed Jovanovski for an alpha star player that would never have played in my team. So now I just have to develop Ed Jovanovski. He should become probably I would say a 2.5-star defenseman. Is it a superstar? No. But if he does become a 2.5-star defenseman, guess what? That's a decent NHLer that I got for basically somebody that would never have played for me. So you never know what you're going to get. So that's probably my pro tip for the video, is make sure that you look at who you have on expiring contracts and try to squeeze as much value out of those players as possible without gutting your roster if you're heading to the playoffs, obviously. So that's going to be it. So now in the next video, I'm going to, for real, talk about, the different tactics, roles, and everything on your team, and how to try to build a good solid team. So that's what I'm gonna do for real. I said that it was gonna be this video, but then I realized that I left out some things from the previous video, and turns out that when I just want to add a little bit, I still talk way too much. But anyway, so I do want to thank you for tuning in for those tips. Hopefully they were this was helpful to you. Hopefully you've learned a thing or two. If something is not clear, please let me know in the comments. You can even email me if you go into my from my channel into the About Me. There should be a place there to email me for my email address. You can go ahead and contact me that way if you don't want to put the comments you know, publicly. If you have any requests, put them in there so that I can go ahead and see if I can address them. And well, if you've liked the video, please feel free to like, subscribe, share, comment, all of that good stuff. And until I roll this game again, well, it's gonna be my Tampa Bay play, but eventually I'm gonna be making another tutorial video, so make sure you watch out for those. Thank you, and I'll see you guys later.